Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorraine Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Joshua Cooper Ramo. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's really a pleasure.
Well, you have written this wonderful book, The Seventh Sense. But before we get into what The Seventh Sense is, tell me a little about your background.
Sure. Well, I'm from New Mexico, so that makes it a real pleasure to be here. I always say to people that the most important thing about me is that I'm from New Mexico. It's, when you're from here, it just changes the way you see the world. First of all, one of the great things about growing up in New Mexico is, and I'm reminded of that being here in Santa Fe today, it's so rewarding to be alive to all the sensations around you, whether it's the smell of the air, or the color of the blue sky, or the sound of the leaves and the cottonwood trees. This time of year, I just drove down here and the water was running the acequia, and so there's no question that being from New Mexico is really a great advantage for everybody. I would encourage everybody to be from here if they could.
And one other advantage that you had, you chose your parents very well.
I did my best, yes.
Your mom, Roberta Cooper Ramo, was the first woman president of the American Bar Association,
Yeah.
and she's the president of the American Law Institute. Really a terrific woman.
And a great mother.
And a great mother. And then your dad is much beloved. He's
Yes.
a cardiologist. He was my late husband's doctor.
Yep.
And he's on KOAT, making these complicated medical issues very comprehensive to all of us.
Absolutely.
And you have inherited that because you've taken the most complex issues of our time and you've made it comprehensible in this book. Just one thing before we...
Sure.
China.
Yeah.
You were the translator for the Beijing Olympics.
Well, I
Or you
moved
were
to
the
Beijing
consultant.
in 2002, and I've been based there more or less ever since. I still spend much of my time in China, and I love it. One of the luckiest thing that ever happened, or one of the luckiest things, was during the Beijing Olympics, NBC hired me to be the China analyst, which was an extraordinary experience, as you can imagine, because NBC themselves had paid, I think, $1 billion for the rights to the game. The Chinese had invested many billions of dollars in making sure that the games went well, and all I had to do was show up there and just kind of enjoy it all and explain it to Americans. And I'll tell you, it was really, for somebody who has been in China and wants to understand the country, it was an unforgettable experience.
And you're fluent, of course, in Mandarin. Right?
Speak Mandarin all day long,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. And you work now, you're a co-CEO at the Kissinger.
Exactly, the advisory company of Henry Kissinger, where I've been now for 11 years,
And,
working with Dr. Kissinger, who turns 93 this week.
well, one of our most brilliant minds, for sure.
He's an advertisement for keeping an active mind and an active life as you get older, that's for sure.
And you've done a lot of board work. Starbucks, I think, is one.
I do. I sit on the boards of Starbucks and FedEx.
Well, good. Okay. Now, this is called The Seventh Sense. What is the seventh sense, and what was the sixth sense? Why did you name this? The
Sure.
Seventh Sense?
I started out, and I really wanted to write a book kind of about the nature of the age that we were living in and trying to help people understand it. Also, be honest, to try to understand it myself. And the very first, I think, sort of realization that I came through as I looked around the world was that the scale of what is going on today, all the changes being brought by rapidly interconnected systems of all kinds, not just the internet, systems of data and trade and finance and DNA, the emergence of artificial intelligence, represents a fundamental change to the way that power is distributed in the world. I think the last time we went through that powerful a shift was during the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution was really a 300 or 400 year process, really starting back as far with Luther during the Reformation, which was all about the liberation of the individual. And at the very end of that process, as industrialization was really kicking into gear, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, this is so overwhelming to suddenly have trains and cities and all the speed that we know came about in the 18th and 19th century. He said, our five senses are not going to be enough. We need a sixth sense. And for Nietzsche, the idea of a sixth sense, we said you need a feeling for history. His idea was that if you understood history and you sort of understood the ebb and flow of movements, then as crazy as things were, having a feeling for history would kind of help you hold on and you wouldn't go crazy. Nietzsche, as we know, actually did go crazy. He was just totally overwhelmed by the experience. But that idea that when there's a certain shift in the kind of underlying dynamics of the world, it requires something else to really feel what's going on, got me thinking. And particularly because so much of what I'd seen is that the people who do get this new world often it is more of an instinct. They can't explain to you exactly what it is they know, but they know something. And so I came up with this idea of the seventh sense, which is a feeling for what it means to be enmeshed, what it means to be connected all the time. And there are certain people who have it, and they're easy to spot. You know, people like Travis Kalanick, who started Uber. You and I look at a car seat, and we think that's a car seat. And he had the ability to look at it and see when that thing is connected, there's incredible economic potential locked in there. And so every element of our world now is changing because of connection. And I wanted to see if I could teach people how to feel that, how to understand that. And so the seventh sense is really a guidebook of sorts. It's how I learned to look at the world and see things like they really were.
Well, another example you give is Airbnb. You look at the spare bedroom.
Same thing.
And you think, how can I use this?
Yep.
And you do have a wonderful essay you wrote about your Yahoo experience.
I did. I think we all have moments where we're sort of like, boy, I wish I'd seen that differently. I had a very funny thing happen back in the 90s, which is I had the opportunity to go be a very early employee at Yahoo. And I remember flying out there and looking at them, and I thought, this company's going nowhere. And I got on a plane and went back and took what I thought was a very safe job at Time Inc., Time Magazine, which seemed very secure. And it really taught me that things are not always what they appear. I flew out there. It was 4 guys in a warehouse. I thought, this business has no future. This internet thing, who knows where it's going to go? I had no idea how big it was going to be. And had I been looking with the seventh sense, had I understood that it was the connections those guys had that made the difference, I think I probably would have stayed out there. Having said that, I couldn't be any happier with the choice I did make. I had a great career as a journalist, and I'm having a wonderful time still doing what I'm doing.
So you talk about these networks, and it's not just the internet. Explain what some of the other networks that connect us all are.
So I think the most important thing to understand about a network is any time you have a system of connected points, you have a network. And so we all think of a network. We think of Facebook as a network of connected individuals, or we think of the internet as a collection of connected devices. But really, networks are everywhere now. So connected financial instruments, people who live in Santa Fe is a network to some degree. People who use TCP/IP, the underlying code of the internet, is a network. And the world all around us, as it gets more and more connected, is constantly building networks. And the scale of those networks is growing. So today in the world, for instance, we have about 5 billion people who are connected to the internet one way or another. Well, in coming years, everything in the world is going to be smart. We'll have the so-called Internet of Things, which means that your clothes will be wired, this cup will be wired to know when it's empty, everything will communicate. And we'll move to a world with tens of billions, then hundreds of billions of connected points. It's inevitable that that's going to change the dynamics of power.
Well, the other networks you mentioned are the world financial structure, medical records, medical research. You
Yep.
know, it's phenomenal.
They
when you
all
look at
change as a result of
layers
connection.
of all of these things, and then that they all do connect. But one of the things that you mentioned, that our age is an age of constant connection, but it hasn't always turned out quite the way we thought. We've got the war on terror, and suddenly we have more terrorism. There are waves of refugees. There's pandemics coming. There's the eco collapse. There's all these things going on, and we're awash in all this information without a way to structure it or a place to hold it.
Yep. I think one of the points as you look around the world today that you see that's maybe the most unnerving is that there's almost no institution in the world today that's more respected or trusted than it was 10 years ago. And a lot of that is because of all the problems you just mentioned. There's so many problems in the world that we can see, but we can't do anything about. So the networks let us see global warming. They let us see poverty. They let us see terrorism. They let us see all these financial inequality problems we face with real clarity, both visual clarity and data clarity, but our institutions can't do anything about them. And that accelerates the collapse and the legitimacy of those institutions. And it's one of the reasons I think we've got to start rebuilding them.
One of the early questions you ask in this, it's an age-old question, what is the nature of our age? Can you give us a little history? That's what I love about your book. You combine politics, philosophy, history, and vision.
Sure.
So what is the nature of our age, and what ages have we moved through to get
Sure.
here?
Well, first I'll even give you some history of that question, which is one of the things that changed the most for me when I moved to China in 2002 is it gave me a very different way of looking at the world. And the Chinese are often historically very strategic about how they think about things, and they're very concerned about what's going on in the larger environment. I don't know if you're familiar at all with Chinese classical art, but the most famous paintings are these paintings called shanshui paintings, which are these mountain and waters paintings. Yeah. They're just gorgeous landscapes, but they're filled with these huge mountains and massive expanses of water, and then just little teeny tiny people. And the message in a painting like that is that it's the environment that is much more important than what the individuals want. And so Chinese philosophy always begins with the study of the environment. Partly that's because if you go back in ancient history, China was an agrarian society for a very long period of time. And it was an agrarian society that had a lot of disasters, a lot of floods, a lot of droughts. And so inevitably, if you're living in that kind of world, you're always wondering, how is the larger environment going to affect me? So Chinese always begin with this question. They always say, what is the nature of the age that we're living in? And I'll give you an example from contemporary history. Mao Zedong, when he came to power in 1949 in China, looked at the world and said, we're living in an age of war and revolution. And that's part of the reason he closed China off from the outside world. It's the reason he didn't want to get entangled with the United States, didn't want to get entangled with the Soviet Union. His Marxist view of the world and his view of history made him think the country was entering a very turbulent world order. Deng Xiaoping, who followed Mao Zedong as the primary leader in China when he came to power in 1977, had a very different view of the world. His analysis was that the nature of that age, starting in the late 70s, was one of peace and development, and that China could actually open up. And so what happened under Deng Xiaoping, as we know, is something called reform and opening, and the whole country opened up, and that led to this remarkable growth of the last 30 years, which has lifted 400 million people out of poverty, a really historic calculation. But again, that's all based on that initial conclusion that the nature of the age had changed. So as we look at our age today, I think there were a lot of people who thought over the last 10 or 15 years that the nature of our age was one of the easy spread of democracy and capitalism, that you could open McDonald's in a country and everything would be okay, that every country fundamentally wanted to look like the United States if they could. And what we've seen, particularly in the last decade or so, is that that's not the case. And certainly it's not that easy, that making countries democratic actually in some cases sets them back, because it's not the kind of thing you can have a revolution and then wake up being democratic the next day. And capitalism today operates in a way in which it's not distributing the benefits of the system equally. There's a small group of people who are getting an overwhelming benefit from the system, which is causing a lot of other people to feel that they want the system to stop. So the nature of our age, I think, is one of the replacement of old institutions and old ideas with new institutions and new ideas that are built for the network age. And that's what you've got to accept. It's a bit unnerving to think that many of the structures we've relied on for the last 30 or 40 years may not be around in another 30 or 40 years. But history teaches us that it's possible to reinvent these institutions so they can serve our needs better.
Well, you even mentioned that anything not built for the network age will crack under the pressure of this enmeshment, of this connectivity. And it's change or die, the old maxim.
Yeah.
And people are, a lot of our leadership is not changing. They're applying the old paradigm to a new system where the old paradigm is irrelevant.
Yes, it's very difficult to get people to change. I mean, that's the historical lesson when you go back and you read the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution literature is people want to hold on to what they have.
Well, we're speaking today with Joshua Cooper Ramo about his new book, The Seventh Sense. It's very complex, a thrilling read. I want to talk a little bit more about the networks and the relationship of the speed of life, time, and the compression of time. So we're all networked, connected on so many levels, and again, faster and faster and faster, so that distance is no longer as relevant as time. Talk to me about that.
Well, one of the things I tried to explore in the book, and part of the adventure of the book, was really understanding as I looked at these various connected systems, what are they for? Why are we connected all the time anyhow? I mean, right, it would be easy enough to not connect or to unplug. And what you find out is that the networks exist because we want to use them to compress time in a sense. Think of it this way. The Industrial Revolution, the great secret of the Industrial Revolution was the compression of space. That using sailing ships and then trains and then airplanes, it was possible to move things closer together than they'd ever been before. That instead of taking a year to get to Asia, it took a week to get to Asia, and then it took 8 hours to get to Asia, and that space was becoming ever less important. The networks, in a sense, allow us to compress time. There are all kinds of things, like if you wanted to learn how to cook the ideal bread or how to perform a particular kind of surgery, but in the past it might have taken you months or years to get that education. Now you can go online and a video will teach you how to do that. And so the compression of time is really what networks do best. They make things happen instantly. The problem is, as you can imagine, we're not used to things happening instantly all the time. And that constant acceleration of time has always been a puzzle in the past. There's a great line by a German general in World War I who said, this whole war could have been avoided if the negotiations had only been conducted by the speed of horseback. The fact that we started using this darn telegraph, none of us had time to think. So compare the telegraph to where we are now, which is this kind of almost instant need to react to things. You can see that really we have to retool the way we think.
And you also mentioned that the new battleground, is for the control of time.
That's right.
And getting people's attention, let me have 5 minutes of your time.
Yeah.
Something like that, that it's for control of time and attention.
Yeah, it used to be that in a war, for instance, the thing you wanted to control was territory. But now you can actually control nations just by controlling the networks that they depend on without actually having to control the territory. And particularly, you can manipulate their time, right? If you're having a war with a country and you can cause the national defense forces to respond more slowly by using computer hacks and other sorts of things, and if you can cause the population to be panicked more quickly using various technologies, you're manipulating the time of the enemy. It's a very different approach than trying to control the territory.
Well, another thing, one of the most stimulating aspects of this was the whole thing about gates and gatekeepers. You said that there are new structures now that are born of this connectivity. Talk to me about gates and gatekeepers. You also say you are entering gateland the moment you turn on your telephone.
Yes. So one of the things that was really important to me in this book is I wanted to write something that everybody who read it could figure out exactly how it applies to their lives. Because I think a lot of this is kind of very abstract. It's very complex. I wanted a book that people could pick up and immediately say, this is how I can apply this to my business. This is how I can apply this to my children's education, and know what they ought to do. Because it's clear that your business and your children's education probably does need to change for this new world. One of the most interesting examples of this is how we think about this world that we're a part of right now. And one of the insights about networks, about any connected system, whether it's Facebook or a stock market, is that it turns out the act of connecting any group of points or any group of people together is also the act of drawing a line around that group. So everybody who's a part of Facebook, they're on the inside of what you might think of as a closed system called the Facebook system, and everybody else is outside of it. Those of us who use Google, when we connect to Google, in a sense, are part of that Google universe, and there's incredible power that comes about as a result of that. What happens in networks is that when you're inside these systems, you get incredible benefits. You get this benefit of the compression of time, which we talked about earlier. You get access to information you couldn't get any other way. And the cost of being outside turns out to be huge, very dramatic. If I say to you, today I've got a medical database with all kinds of DNA in it. It's got 1 million people's DNA in it, and we're going to use that to help diagnose something that's wrong with a patient. Cutting somebody out of 1 million people database is a very costly decision. But in a few years, when that database has 100 million people or 1 billion people in it, the cost of being left out is really likely to be fatal. Yeah. And so that decision about having this world as a closed community and deciding who comes in and out is really a system of gatekeeping. It's that act of making this determination about who's inside or outside of a system. And it turns out in a connected world, that's the most powerful place to be. There's also something very interesting about this world, which is you and I are gatekept today. We're gatekept by our phone company, we're gatekept by the financial system, we're gatekept by Facebook, we're gatekept by Google. And have we really thought through the terms of our gatekeptness, the terms of our enmeshment? One of the things is that the gatekeepers depend on the compliance of the gate kept. And so trying to figure out how to balance that becomes a very interesting question.
Well, yeah, you said, are you the gatekeeper or are you the gate kept? Well, there's only a few gatekeepers. And then you talk about the new caste.
Yeah.
Because those are the gatekeepers, and they're very few, and they're not the people that would have ruled the old power structures. It's a completely new thing. Talk about the new caste and who are the gatekeepers.
So, one way you can look at history, particularly European history, say, is the interaction of various groups, various elite groups. So there's a theory that you can tell the story of all of Europe's history through the interaction of 3 castes, 3 kind of groups of people: the merchants, the soldiers, and the sages. And if you look at the rise of France, for instance, it's an example of the sages and the bureaucrats working together with the soldiers. Or the British Empire is an example of the merchants, that caste of people, interacting very well with the British Navy, which is the soldiers. And so all of European history you can sort of explain through the interaction and the moving pieces of these 3 groups. Today, all around us, we have the emergence of what I think of as a 4th group, what I call the new caste, which are the people who really control and understand these networks. There's a small group of people who control the Facebook algorithms or the Google algorithms, and they have more influence than almost any group in human history. They tend to be young. They tend to be based on the West Coast. They tend to be very ambitious for what their technology can accomplish. They don't necessarily understand much about the world, even if they understand an awful lot about the networks. But as a group themselves, they have more power than any group in human history has ever had. And it's a little bit of an inversion because, usually in a well-settled society, the people who have the most power and influence tend to be older. It's the people with the most experience who've kind of worked their way up a given ladder. And today we have people in the world who are incredibly powerful, who almost by definition have to be under 30 because they're the only ones who understands what's going on.
Well, some of the people who wrote recommendations on your book, you have Malcolm Gladwell, you have Walter Isaacson, the Steve Jobs book, Fareed Zakaria. I mean, these are people whose job is to see what's going on, and they have nailed this book as just absolutely crucial for anyone who wants to understand what's going on. And so we don't have much time left. I need you to talk to me about politics today.
Sure.
Who is in charge of the images that and the gates that are keeping us enclosed, and how can we as citizens, how do we develop a seventh sense?
So I think the political question is ultimately, particularly in this election year, and as we sit here in the State House, right, it is the ultimate question. I'll tell you, if you and I were sitting here a year ago, and I had said to you, who's the most likely Republican nominee? The guy with 2 presidents in the family, 4 decades of political experience, and all the wealthy backers, or a guy with 5 million Twitter followers who's a real estate developer, very few people would have picked this guy. Everybody would have picked this guy. And it turns out that what was really important about Trump was what he was connected to. He was and is connected to an entire network of connections that were largely invisible using traditional ways of thinking. This really is going to be a network election. It's going to be decided not through the traditional media so much as it's decided in the non-traditional media and the way people engage.
The last election, because Obama was so in control of social media and those networks, is one of the reasons he did as well as he did.
That's exactly right. And that's just gotten more and more to be part of the puzzle of how elections unfold.
But let's go internationally, because we're all appalled at what ISIS has done and is doing. But how have they used social media and networking?
Well, I think it's very important to remember that when ISIS first emerged, many military experts said these guys are just the JV of terror. It's 20 yahoos with a bunch of trucks. There's nothing they can do to hurt anybody. But what they figured out very cleverly was that they could use these horrible videos that they make to spread their message insidiously on networks. That having access to some drones and some cameras and an internet connection made them everybody as powerful and influential to some degree as the Sixth Fleet. And that collision between classical power and network power is something you see everywhere in the world now. And one of the real risks is that often it's very difficult to defeat network power. So that's where we are today. We've had a war on terror that's gone on for 15 years now, and the longest war in American history, and we have yet to eradicate the problem.
Well, we've had the war on drugs, and it didn't make any difference.
Also a network force, that's right. So you really need to think differently when you think about confronting network problems.
So how do we, a normal, observant, intelligent person, how do we develop this instinct, this sense of the seventh sense? And you say you'll know it when it hits.
Well, one of the things you can do, and I think I didn't know when I started writing the book that this was true, but you can definitely learn it. And the book is designed to tell you step by step how to get the seventh sense, something any of us can actually acquire. But the first thing is you've got to start looking at objects or people or ideas and say, what is this connected to? That really turns out to be the most important question. We tend to try to understand something by just looking at it very, very intently. And actually, its real importance is often determined by all the things that are around it.
Give me an example.
Well, I mean, a classic example of this would be the political campaigns, right? If you're trying to understand any of the ideas, any of the proposals, you have to ask yourself, where does the United States sit in the world? What is it connected to? What are its real advantages? And not just evaluate the idea, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, and everybody can have their own opinion about building a wall or trying to push a certain kind of educational reform. The real question you have to ask is, how does that affect the American position in the networks overall? And how does that affect the American citizens who are also plugged into networks?
Well, you do have you end the book with an appeal to citizens. So would you make it now to our New Mexicans?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, I think particularly in the case of New Mexico, which is a place that is so dear to my heart, having grown up here and watched the state struggle again and again to try to find a way to be as really magnificent and flourishing as I think all of us who live here think it should be. One of the things you realize is this is a moment of incredible opportunity, that if we can get the state connected to the right things, put into the right networks, it should be able to grow very fast. The state has incredible resources. The challenge here is now, and has always been, people here don't like change. And they have to understand that the world is changing one way or another, and the responsibility is to figure out how to be as flexible and engaged with that process as possible. Because the bad news is one of the things that the networks do is they rapidly accelerate the distinction between those who are successful and those who are not. That middle ground that used to exist doesn't really survive very much in a network age. So it really is either a case of change and catch up or just be left behind. And for a state like New Mexico, where there's so much possibility, so much great culture and intellectual resources, you've just got to get over that hump here, if we can all do it, to say what we really need to do is change and adjust for this new age.
Now, how do we want to shift from being gate kept, which is, enclosed in all of these structures that someone else has set up? How can a person become a gatekeeper?
Well, I think there's two things. One is, to some degree, we're always going to be gatekept on some of these systems, and we actually want to be. In network science, we call these systems positive sum systems, which means that the more people who use them, the better they get, so therefore more people use them. So you and I are probably happy to be gatekept on a system of the right kind of medical information that can be helpful to us as we move forward. The real challenge we think about our own lives is, are we discerning about how we're getting connected and what we're paying for every connection? So, for instance, if I'd said to you 5 years ago or 6 years ago, look, I want to have a device on you that follows your every movement, follows you around every single day, keeps a record on a map, and in exchange for that, I'm going to save you 5 minutes in traffic. You would have said not in a million years. But with your iPhone or my Android phone, that's exactly what we're doing. Those phones are tracking us all the time. And the fact they're tracking so many of us means they can give us advice about how to drive. And so that trade-off between liberty and convenience is one of the things that as citizens we've got to start to be aware of.
Well, you mentioned when the Snowden report was first released, that everybody had thought all this information would be used for good, all this information gathering, and suddenly it was, not being used for good. That was a real shock.
I think it really was. I think for a lot of people there was, even though people knew it could potentially be used this way, what I found is a lot of people I know who are in the tech community, those papers came out, and for everybody it just was really a shocking blow, the degree to which this had been used in ways people never had anticipated.
And that's, you opened my eyes to so many things. I'm sorry we've run out of time.
That's all right. Thank you so much for having me.
Our guest is Joshua Cooper Ramo. Folks, this book, The Seventh Sense, will really change how you operate in this world. I think it's an extraordinary book. Thank you for writing it, and thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our networked audience, for joining us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.